March 12, 1999, Dr. David Tipton approached his home in Decatur, Alabama, a little bit earlier than usual. He and his housewife, Karen, had plans to go to the theater that evening. As he hung up his coat in the foyer, he shouted to let Karen know that he was home. "This is a big house," he later explained. "I did call for her. She should have been there with the children." At that point, I saw a drop of blood. One small drop of blood on the foyer, on the tile. The next thing I saw was more blood in the foyer, toward the door. And I walked up the stairs and was the most surprised person on the face of the earth to get to the top and find a dead body there that looked somewhat like Karen. Through the shock and gore of it all, David Tipton had a hard time recognizing the body of his 39-year-old wife. But it was, unfortunately, Karen. She had been stripped and stabbed over 28 times, and then her throat had been cut. She was in the prime of her life, David later said. She was prettier than she'd ever been in her life. Decatur had never seen quite a murder like this, and the brutality that had been Karen's final moments shocked the community. Investigators rushed to the scene to immediately begin looking for clues, desperate to put Karen's surviving family and Decatur residents back at ease by ridding the streets of a savage killer. David was left to pick up the pieces. "The worst day of my life was about a week after the murder," he said, "and that was when Catherine, then 3 years old, asked me when Mommy was coming back from heaven." The investigators honed in on their prime suspect at the time, David himself. But David had an alibi. Karen answered a phone call around 1 o'clock and usually picked up the children around 2:30, but she hadn't that day. That gave the investigators the window of about an hour and a half that they believed Karen was killed, and David was in his office until around 3:30. David was ruled out as a potential suspect and was actually allowed back into their home to continue living there while the investigation played out. By removing the husband from the pool of suspects, the investigators had ruled out the usual perpetrator in most cases like this, but they did also manage to narrow that pool down quite a bit. There were no signs of forced entry at the home, meaning that Karen had more than likely known her killer. However, the Decatur community at large were unimpressed with this nugget of information, and the police department began to feel the mounting pressure building on all sides. High-profile, rich doctor's wife, defense lawyer Sherman Powell later said, "Beautiful lady, brutally slain. I think there was a lot of pressure on them. They had to have something." About a month after Karen was murdered, the police caught a break when a man named Sparky Moore walked into the station with a startling confession. He claimed that he had just had a chilling conversation with his nephew, Daniel Wade Moore. A conversation where Daniel said, "You know the Tipton murder? The doctor's wife that was murdered on Chapel Hill Road? Well, I was there." During this now infamous conversation, Daniel did not admit to killing Karen, but did say that he was there during the time of the murder, and that was enough for the investigators. They honed in on Daniel and brought him down to the station, where this case witnessed another shocking turn of events. When the officers left Daniel alone in the interrogation room, Daniel whipped out a pocket knife from his jacket and began stabbing himself. For the investigators, Daniel trying to kill himself was as good as a confession, and they arrested him then and there. They believed that Daniel was simply trying to avoid his punishment because deep down, Daniel knew that he was guilty of murder. But it didn't take much to start finding a few holes in this theory. Daniel has since denied any involvement in Karen's murder and has only ever confessed to his uncle during that one conversation. During that conversation, he claimed that he and some other men had broken into the Tipton household and that Karen had been killed downstairs while Daniel had been upstairs. But as the investigation itself proved, Karen had been killed upstairs. In fact, they even found blood in the bed, suggesting that Karen had first been attacked there before escaping. Her killer had then caught up with her at the top of the stairs and finished killing her there. And then there's the crucial fact that the investigators found no signs of forced entry at the home. But both the prosecution and David Tipton argued that Daniel would not have needed to force his way in. He'd actually been there a few months before as part of the team that installed the Tiptons' new home security system. It was possible that Karen recognized him, and it was possible that Daniel had bluffed his way in by stating that he was there to check up on the system. But that still would not explain why Daniel was confused about the details of Karen's murder, or why he would even confess to his uncle in the first place. Daniel himself had an explanation for that. Quote, "I'd been on drugs for a while. I'd pretty much given up on life. I wanted to get my grandfather and my uncle to leave me alone." Time and distance. That is what Daniel claimed he lied about the murder to get. He wanted the space to take drugs without being bothered by his family, and so he had said what he said. His lawyer, Sherman Powell, argued at court that Daniel had never confessed to anything that he couldn't have read in a newspaper, and even the details weren't exactly accurate. Sherman Powell did, however, point the finger at another suspect. This was not something a burglar, robber, or rapist, or anybody does, he said in court. Not even a contract killer does it. This was a crime of passion, period. According to Sherman Powell, it was actually David Tipton who had killed his wife. The prosecution argued against this claim and continued to put the blame on Daniel Moore, but even the presiding judge, Glenn Thompson, had his doubts. Upon receiving the jury's written verdict, the judge recalled, "A former law partner saw my reaction. He said he saw the blood drain out of my face. He said I just turned white from the top down. I was that surprised. I didn't think the state had proven it. Too many unanswered questions. It never got to the point beyond a reasonable doubt." But for the jury, it had, and they found Daniel Wade Moore guilty of murder. Judge Thompson was given no other alternative than to follow the law and to punish Daniel as harshly as he could. It's not that I wanted to sentence him to death, but I did. During the appeals, a now infamous and case-breaking piece of information came to the surface, one that involved Karen herself. It turned out that Karen had a secret life, one that included extramarital affairs. Was it possible that one of Karen's lovers had turned on her and killed her in her own home? Is that why the attack had started in the bedroom and then ended with Karen naked at the top of the stairs? Spurred on by this new information, Sherman Powell continued to dig for anything that could spare Daniel from his sentence. And then Sherman found Pam Smith, a neighbor who claimed to have seen Karen out and about at 3:30 on the afternoon that she was murdered. If this was true, that would completely shift the timeline of Karen's killings away from when the investigators believe it happened and open up the possibility of other suspects. The prosecution discredited Pam's testimony, but one person did find it compelling, Judge Glenn Thompson. 2 years after sentencing Daniel to death, the very same judge overturned his conviction and set him free. Quote, "I thought I'd committed political suicide. I really did. I did it anyway. It was the right thing to do." Daniel went from awaiting execution to complete freedom. For 4 whole days, anyway. Determined, the authorities rearrested Daniel and got to work trying to make sure that this time he stayed behind bars. 9 whole years after Karen was killed, Daniel faced charges for her murder for the second time. After 6 days to review the evidence, the jury shockingly came back empty-handed. "We tried very, very hard," a juror later said outside the courtroom, "and we just couldn't do it." Daniel's second trial was a mistrial. That meant that Daniel would face a third. This time the jury took 7 days, and this time they came to a decision. Daniel was found not guilty. A verdict that was a victory for some and a loss for others. David and his daughters believe that Daniel is Karen's killer. Sherman Powell and others still point the finger at David, but Karen's case remains open, and after so many years with so little evidence, it's difficult to say whether her killer will ever be brought to justice. That's 10-Minute Murder for today. Brief and bingeable true crime. I'm Joe, I'm the host, and thank you for taking the time to listen to 10-Minute Murder. If you are a brand new listener, first of all, welcome in. And make sure you hit subscribe wherever you're listening right now. That's going to more easily help you catch up on all the back episodes. You can binge away at your leisure. And also, if you're a subscriber, you can more easily find the podcast every time there's a new episode released. You can just open the app that you like to listen in, and then boom, it's going to be right there at the top. Easy for you to check out. My website address, 10minutemurder.com. There you'll find blogs, you'll find all the ways that you can listen, all the places. You'll find social media links, and also my email address, joe@10minutemurder.com. If you've got friends and family, and they happen to be into true crime stories, maybe brief ones like 10 Minute Murder, let them know about the podcast. And that's it. That's your episode for today. Thank you so much for listening to 10 Minute Murder.